You may have watched every episode of Bonanza, died of dysentery playing Oregon Trail, and read all the best Louis L'Amour novels, and of course, devoured all the stories on classic Western sites. But do you really know life in the Old West? If you've done all that, you probably know more about the West than the average American does. Kudos. However, many aspects of life on the Western frontier didn't make it into pop culture, and inaccurate myths have replaced them or nearly been forgotten altogether. The old Wild West is the stuff of legend. Gunslingers robbing banks and trains, and cowboys on long cattle drives. But every time period has its strange stories, and the Wild West is no different. Some of those stories are exactly what you'd expect, while others are surprisingly modern. In today's video, we bring to you incredible facts about the Wild West. Stay tuned as we show you 10 crazy cool facts that tell the true story of the Wild West. Ask any American about the Civil War, and they'll tell you about battles that raged up and down the eastern seaboard. From Gettysburg and Antietam to Charleston and Sherman's March on Georgia. It was all limited to the east, right? Not exactly. As it turned out, there was a very important Civil War skirmish way out west in New Mexico, to be exact. It was one of the most important battles of the entire war, at least as far as westward expansion was concerned. In late March of 1862, New Mexico was a wild backcountry full of untamed land. However, the northern part of the area gave settlers access to southern Colorado's mountainous region. With it came the promise of very lucrative mining territory in the Rocky Mountains, and battling over New Mexico allowed any potential victor basically unfettered access all the way out to California. So, while New Mexico may have been a long way from the plantations of the Deep South, its strategic importance for the future of slavery was massive. Both the Union and the Confederacy knew this, and even though neither side had many men stationed that far west, each group understood how critical it was to lay claim to the land. So, on March 26, 1862, the Battle of Glorieta Pass kicked off. It only involved about 2,500 soldiers, but it turned out to be a decisive early moment in the Civil War. Texas Confederates claimed victory early on, after nearly wiping out a branch of Union militants. But after a few days of brutal fighting, a tough band of New Mexico volunteers climbed the cliff face of Glorieta Mesa. Gaining the high ground by surprise, they got the angle on a large group of now defenseless Texans down below. The Union won the bloody battle, and of course, a few years later, the war. But while it's not talked about much in the history books today, Glorieta Pass marked a key moment in the fight. Had the Texans taken the area, the Confederacy would have easily pushed west. They could have invaded Arizona and from there laid claim to lands in Mexico. Then, with no opposition, they'd have rolled right through to California. Its coastline would have given them an endless array of options for seaports and shipping lanes. Oh, what could have been if not for that brave 1862 stand in the highlands of New Mexico? We like to think of alien abduction stories and UFO sightings as a recent phenomenon. As technology has rapidly increased over the last 100 or so years, aliens have supposedly descended on us from outer space. But the truth is that UFO claims have been made for centuries, and they were actually somewhat common in the Wild West. One of the most notable Western alien allegations came back in 1896. In the frontier town of Lodi, California, a Civil War veteran and journalist named H.G. Shaw claimed he and a buddy saw a group of extraterrestrials. According to Shaw, who wrote about the incident in the local newspaper, the otherworldly characters were 7 feet tall and very slender, with small hands, fingers without nails, and feet twice as long as normal and functioned similarly to a monkey's feet. And he wasn't done there. The newspaper man even had a theory about why the aliens arrived in the first place. Those we beheld were inhabitants of Mars, Shaw wrote in the Lodi News Sentinel, who have been sent to the Earth for the purpose of securing one of its inhabitants. Sound familiar? All those alien abduction stories of the past few decades had to start somewhere, after all. Shaw supposed sighting wasn't the only unsettling UFO event out west. A year after the Lodi incident, citizens of the tiny town of Aurora, Texas, reported seeing cigar-shaped flying saucers cruising high overhead. A few months after that, the town's rattled citizens even claimed that a UFO allegedly slipped from the heavens and exploded in the middle of the town. Skeptics said it was merely a meteorite, but allegations of an alien visit remained a rumor in town for years after. Evidently, small-town life way out west gave way to many interesting observations. Whether those were the product of isolation and boredom or legitimate UFO interactions is anybody's guess. But of course, the most famous alien event did happen out west. To hear native tribes around modern-day Nevada tell it, there used to be a red-haired band of giant cannibals who roamed the area. They terrorized local native bands across the thousands of years ago. For centuries, members of the northern Paiute tribe have been handing down old tales about a supposed tribe of giants called the Sitaika. According to the Paiute, that tribe was a cannibalistic band of fiery-haired ginger. If that sounds equal parts scary and weird, well, keep watching. The Paiute claim the cannibal group used to eat a fibrous water plant that helped turn their hair a fiery color. Then, they would hunt humans all across the high deserts of the Old West, long before Eastern settlers ever made it out there. Thankfully, the Paiute put a stop to all this long ago. According to a northern Paiute tribal activist and archivist named Sarah Winnemucca Hopkins, Paiute warriors were able to trap all the Sitaika clan members in a large, dark cave. Then the Paiute lit the cave entrance on fire. The cannibals perished inside, never to be heard from again. According to Hopkins herself, Paiute elders have handed down stories about defeating these giants for many, many years. My people say that the tribe we exterminated had reddish hair, Hopkins wrote in a book about Paiute customs. I have a dress which has been in our family for many years, trimmed with reddish hair. It is called a mourning dress, and no one has such a dress but my family. And yet, even though that legend may be hundreds of years old, modern historians and folklorists think there actually was a tribe in the area for whom red hair was a common genetic hand-me-down. However, they almost certainly weren't giants. They might just have been slightly taller than most regional tribes of the day. Or, even more likely, the Sitaika were of normal height, and centuries of oral retellings have turned that myth into a particularly bad game of telephone. Regardless, the legend is now part of Paiute lore. As far as they are concerned, Nevada was once a land of very angry and very hungry giants. The Kentucky-West Virginia border's world-famous Hatfield and McCoy families weren't the only notorious feuding clans of the old days. In fact, the Old West had a feud that went even further than that infamous incident. After the Civil War, Texas had two families, the Suttons and the Taylors, who really didn't like each other. The feud started when Buck Taylor shot and killed a Sutton ally in 1866, then escalated with the deaths of Taylor and a man named Dick Chisholm. 2 years later, in a horse sale gone wrong, Taylor's remaining family members dug in their heels. They had Southern pride and were mad about the Confederacy's decisive defeat in the Civil War. The Suttons, meanwhile, had the backing of local Texas militia members and state police outfits keen on Reconstruction. The Sutton family's patriarch, William, took control of the police himself by 1869, running raids across the state to ferret out cattle rustlers sympathetic to the Taylors. Over the next 5 years, all of DeWitt County, Texas was plunged into a horrifically violent feud. Even members of other families were forced to take sides and choose between the Suttons and Taylors. Those who didn't offer allegiance risked being killed. Then again, Those who did pick a team were killed in skirmishes and senseless violence too. By 1874, so many people had died in DeWitt County that the Texas Rangers finally rode in. They worked for months to ease tensions. They were mostly unsuccessful, but by the end of 1875, the feud started to slow. It wasn't because of anybody's particular negotiating skill. It was merely because the most aggressive and vicious feud participants on each side had mostly been killed by then. The next few years saw several more violent murders, but the rate was thankfully dwindling. By the end of the 1870s, at least 22 Taylor family members had died compared to 13 Suttons. Scores of friends and allies on each perished amid the senseless violence as well. Then, for the next 20 years, Texas courts tried to sort out the legal mess that came from it all. But it wasn't until the end of the 19th century that most family members and friends finally moved on. As the Old West was being settled, slavery was still commonplace throughout the South. Before the Civil War, though, even more pressing questions spread across the plains. Elsewhere in the West, the issue of slavery was still being worked out among newly formed states. In Oregon, the state's government was first founded way back in 1844. During that time, the state decided it did not want slavery. So a local founding father named Peter Burnett wrote an amendment to prevent the heinous act. In the bill, slavery was stated to always be illegal in Oregon. Families who brought slaves to settle in the state would have 3 years to remove them out of the country. And if those slaves weren't removed after the 3-year time limit, they would be deemed free men. But there was a bizarre catch in that political push. Section 6 of Burnett's bill made it so that any former slaves who were brought to Oregon and freed had to leave the state immediately, and the penalty for not doing so was incredibly severe. The bill became known as Peter Burnett's Lash Law, because that final section ordered freed slaves who remained in Oregon to be whipped not less than 20 or more than 39 stripes. Essentially, Burnett intended to make it illegal for black people ever to settle in or live in Oregon. And by 1849, that's exactly how the law was interpreted. It's unclear if any freed slaves were ever brought to Oregon and let loose later to be lashed. But the bill effectively banished black people from living in the newly formed state. Burnett was specifically concerned that ex-slave settlers would work to instill into their minds feelings of hostility toward the white race. Even more amazingly, the exclusion rule stayed in place in the state all the way up until 1926. Years before the Transcontinental Railroad became a reality, westward expansion was thought to be possible thanks to camels. Horses were a major part of Western culture, but camels could plod along for miles on end, carrying considerable weight on their backs. Plus, owing to the desert life, baked into millions of years of their evolution, they were theoretically prepared to handle the comparatively less harsh conditions of the western United States. So, in the 1840s and 1850s, supply trains began using camels to traipse across shorter journeys in various regions from Texas to Washington. By the late 1850s, a man named Edward Fitzgerald Beale walked several dozen camels. All leaving the Midwest, they completed a 1,200-mile journey to a destination just north of Los Angeles. Pioneers took immediate notice. One man, a Confederate major named Henry Wayne, went on record saying, "Americans will be able to manage camels not only as well, but better than Arabs, as they will do it with more humanity and with far greater intelligence." Casting aside the era's cold racism, the statement was brimming with positivity about what camels could do for those traveling across the difficult West. In 1857, the United States government purchased hundreds of camels for logistical purposes and put them out to pasture in Texas. For a few years, they forgot about them. And then the Civil War hit. When it happened, opportunistic Confederates in the state rounded up the beasts and used them for the military effort. The camels effectively became known as the Camel Corps. Some were used to deliver mail and other goods around the region. Others were caught and sold for profit that went into purchasing war goods. At least one died in battle. The 43rd Mississippi Infantry's camel named Old Douglas became famous after sustaining mortal wounds during the siege of Vicksburg. In the end, the Camel Corps didn't really work out for the Confederacy. One who lived in the brutal Arizona desert came to be known as the Red Ghost. He once trampled a woman to death in a frontier town, and later his legend grew to include all kinds of other tall tales. Wild camels weren't fated to live out a North American life, though. As the West was won, the few dozen wild camels remaining soon died out and faded from memory. There have been countless legends and rumors about creepy and fantastical events, but no frontier myths are more persistent than the intriguing tales of lost mines and unearthed fortunes. Of course, much of the West was settled after various gold and silver rushes brought men to the land. Thousands of young and sometimes old men back east who felt lucky or reckless or were just plain bored struck out west for a chance at a new life. Most failed miserably while panhandling for gold. But the few who did strike it, rich left the rest, hoping they could somehow still find that one quick score. Thus, legends quickly spread about supposed lost mines, hidden treasures, and uncovered loot. Miners hid their riches away from prying thieves. These claims clamored, and the gold is still out there waiting to be rediscovered. Most of those tales were entirely false, of course, but that didn't stop would-be miners from spreading them around all the same. For decades, long after these gold rushes had ended, tales of hidden mines and buried treasure made their way back east. The most famous one, which still draws attention today, is that of the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. Supposedly set way up in the Superstition Mountains outside Phoenix, the mine is said to have been first dug out by a German immigrant named Jacob Waltz nearly 200 years ago. For decades after Waltz supposedly left the area, prospectors turned up to search for it. Nobody has ever found it, though, and some people have died trying, and plenty of other alleged uncovered mines across the West hold similar allure. William Crush was a railroad executive with a penchant for the dramatic. Intent on getting Americans to want to travel by rail during the very end of the 19th century, he opted to go bigger than big. In 1894, he was looking to finance the future of a new railroad venture called the Missouri-Kansas-Texas Railroad Company, popularly known as the Katy. This rail line needed funds to start up during the age of rail. So, Crush put together a massive carnival at a temporary Texas town that he named after himself and invited the public to visit. It wasn't just any carnival, though. The main attraction was two 35-ton train engines getting smashed together to show the railroad's incredible might. Yes, this is what passed for entertainment back in the days of the Old West. And yes, it was a resounding success by all financial and personal accounts, except for the people who perished in the awful train crash. On the day of the planned train collision, Crush was temporarily the second-largest city in all of Texas. More than 40,000 people came to the area from all around. Just as he promised, Mr. Crush set off two steam-powered trains down the track straight for each other. Each train went down the tracks at well over 50 miles per hour. When they hit, there was a massive explosion that blasted steam, fire, and train parts high up into the sky. 2 people were killed in the massive explosion, and hundreds more were injured, but thousands beyond that were sold on the power of the railroad. One man, a witness named J.C. Dean, received $10,000 from Crush's Katy Railroad Company after losing an eye in the awful accident. The railroad's overseers were horrified at William Crush's antics and fired him after learning about the deadly collision. But days later, after the railroad saw how much public attention was drawn toward them after the shocking show, they quickly rehired Crush and asked for more. It just goes to show that even way back then, no publicity was bad publicity. From the ever-present attraction of Las Vegas to the rise of online sports betting in more recent times, gambling has always been a part of American life. It was that way in the Old West, too. In one major sense, that's just how things were. You had to be something of a gambler at heart to strike out west in the first place. So many things could kill a pioneer while they were headed out west that they were all essentially gambling with their lives right as they began the trip. So by the time people got out west, it was well understood they were already feeling lucky. And as they arrived, it was only natural to pass the time by playing cards all while trying to make a buck or two to survive. Gambling was such a regular part of life in the Wild West that it was an esteemed job, like doctors, saloon keepers, lawyers, and other business owners. Card sharks and other gamblers won esteem for their work. In the early West, gambling was considered a profession, as legitimate a calling as the clergy, the law, or medicine. One historian famously wrote, "All across the West, high-stakes games and large potential pots attracted full-time gamblers. Men traveled from town to town, making their money at the card table. Some gamblers resorted to cheating and shady schemes to win against unsuspecting locals. Then they would take their winnings and quickly skip town before they could be caught." Professional gambling was practically a religion in California. Card players traveled there throughout the 19th century and offered their talents for cash. In the end, it became a destination for many men seeking to travel through the frontier. In addition to gambling, whiskey just seemed to hit the spot for people on the frontier. But the whiskeys that were offered up for consumption at the time weren't exactly things you'd want to drink today. The names alone sounded wild. 40 rods, tarantula juice, Tao's lightning, and all kinds of other exotic-sounding drinks came out west. The truth is, they were beyond potent. Many would contain almost unbelievable ingredients, even literal poisons like strychnine. Other liquors included things like turpentine and tobacco oil. For many people, drinking the first shot required them to purchase a second shot, just to wash down and forget about the first. If they could stomach it, the drinker would be so far gone after a couple of rounds that they'd forget what they were drinking and drift off into a chemical-induced slumber, only to do it all again the next day. From a logistical perspective, this probably shouldn't come as a surprise. After all, Western saloons were often few and far between. The distances between towns were vast, and the logistics and supply lines were inconsistent at best. And with that, there weren't any food or beverage regulations being enforced anywhere in the West during the 19th century. So, without rules to lay out what whiskey should and shouldn't entail, saloon keepers simply got creative. On that note, we end today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you will be the first to see our new updates.